Well, welcome everyone to Nonprofit Problem Solver podcast. This is episode 24, and I am really excited about my guest today. It's Kris Putnam-Walkerly, an old friend from Cleveland, and we are going to be talking about and around her new book, which I'm going to hold up which is Delusional Altruism, and the subtitle is Why Philanthropists Fail to Achieve Change and What They Can Do to Transform Giving. Now, what I normally do, as people who've listened to this before will know, is that I normally sort of do the questioning as though I'm wearing an executive director's hat, sometimes a board chair's hat. So it's very much from the nonprofit agency's side. And what I love about this book and this content, Kris, and what you cover is it's primarily from the grant makers or the philanthropist's point of view, but there's some real gold dust in here that I think applies to anyone, including very large public sector organizations I've worked for in the past. So hello, welcome. Why don't you say, just tell us a little bit about your background. I know you've got, lots of practice putting bios together.
Yes, thank you so much, Kev. It's great to be here. So my name is Kris Putnam-Walkerly, and I am a global philanthropy advisor, which means I work with ultra high net worth donors, leaders of foundations and corporate giving programs who, genuinely want to change the world and make a difference, but are often stuck in figuring out exactly how to accomplish that. And so I help them to really increase their impact, no matter the circumstances. And I've been doing this for 20 years. And I also, write a lot. So Delusional Altruism is my second book. And I write for Forbes.com about philanthropy as well.
Yes. And you are a prolific poster on LinkedIn, one of the many social media platforms on which I follow you. So that's a good place for people to get in touch or to follow you. Is there any other particular way that people can reach out to find you online or ask you a question?
Sure. Yeah. LinkedIn's a great place. I'm very active there. And my LinkedIn name is Kris Putnam, I believe. And my website is Putnam Consulting, putnam-consulting.com. And so that's a great place to, access all my contact information, all my social media, and also a link to the book as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so on to the book. When did it come out? It was earlier. It was just late 2020, was it?
In March of 2020.
Oh, March.
So March
It's been that long.
So it's about a week into lockdown.
Right. Okay, so what was the genesis of the book? And tell us a little bit about the sort of response it's had and how you've sort of developed your thinking in as it's now out in the world. And it was probably a couple of years since you wrote at least some of the words, I'm sure. So how has the conversation evolved?
Yeah. Well, the genesis of the book actually came from a question that I often ask my clients and that I asked myself. And the question is, if you could only accomplish one thing this year, but it was going to be your legacy at your organization, what would it be?
Wow.
And I like that question because, it really gets to the heart of like what's most important. We all feel like we have 20 priorities and maybe we can come up with 3, but what's that one most important thing you want to accomplish because it's going to be your legacy? And so I asked myself that question, and immediately this book came to mind. And so I realized I had to publish it. It had been on my mind for a while. And the idea of the book, Delusional Altruism, comes from advising funders for 20 years and recognizing that, philanthropists are, generally speaking, genuine in their delusions, not genuine in their altruism. Maybe they are genuine in their delusions, genuine in their altruism, really wanting to make a difference, change the world, have a positive impact on other people's lives, but are often getting in their own way. And often they don't even realize that this is happening. They're actually preventing themselves from having the impact that they want. And that's because they're holding on to really a handful of, I think, misguided beliefs and practices that are restraining them, and they don't realize it. And so I wanted to write the book to be both, a bit provocative, but also very practical and helping funders recognize how this happens, because it happens to all of us. everything I've written about really has happened to me.
Well, they're common. I mean, they're common in every organization I've come across as well.
Yeah.
The references you make to, well, we'll get into some of the details in a minute, but a very common, with every anecdote of yours that I read, from a foundation. I think, yeah, and then here's another organization, that where that's happened as well.
Yeah, I think what I write about really is applicable to not just philanthropists, but nonprofit leaders, business leaders. I mean, really anybody. And I think from the nonprofit leaders' perspective, the book is really useful for two reasons. One is I think all the lessons, are directly applicable to them as well, but also it's really a glimpse into the insides, into the minds of donors and what's really happening behind the curtain.
Yeah. So, and then how has the conversation evolved? What's been the response? I know you've got sort of glowing endorsements on the book jacket, of course, but as you've been out and you're very active on the conference tour, as much as you can be in lockdown and so on, but how have people responded?
Yeah, the response has been great. The folks that have read the book that, I hear from love it, and find it incredibly helpful. I've talked to many like new foundation leaders who are new to philanthropy, who find it just a super useful guidebook to help them really understand philanthropy. And seasoned leaders, are, finding insights in there that are really helping them with specific problems. I've been, yes, we're on lockdown, but I've been talking to more people about anything about the book than I ever have, in my career, really. I mean, in 9 months last year, I think I gave 24 webinars and virtual keynotes, a lot of, pulling content from the book, and,
Yeah.
have been doing dozens and dozens of podcast interviews. So that's been great. I've had a lot of, I've been giving a lot of keynotes at conferences, and the conference organizers are purchasing, 200, 300 copies of the book and mailing them out to participants as part of the kind of gift box, that you used to get
Great.
at a conference. They'd hand you a bag. Well, now they're shipping boxes of, coffee and coffee mugs and books.
Yeah.
So that's been really fun. Yeah, it's been really positive. And, what surprised me the most actually is how relevant the content is to responding to these crises of the past year, which I didn't expect.
Yeah, I think that's timely. I mean, it's sort of an accidental good fortune. But one of the things that struck me is, I've come across a lot of sort of, I guess, business or professional trade books, have, if you will, and I think a common criticism is that all the real meat is in the first chapter, and then the rest of the book sort of just spins it out in various ways. And what I loved about yours, aside being, very well organized and well written and easy to read, is that there's stuff to go back to over and over and over again, because people are moving at different paces. And over the course of, say, any type of effort to address these things, you're going to need to go back and look at perhaps a different delusion or a different solution. What have you found what have you found of the sort of content has resonated most with foundations?
Yeah, a couple things. One is the mindsets. I talk about a scarcity mindset in philanthropy and then an abundance mindset, and that has really resonated with funders. Efforts to increase speed in philanthropy. So I have a whole chapter about how funders are too slow, and I'm sure your nonprofit listeners will understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then also a whole chapter on how to increase your speed, not just as an organization, but also as an individual. Like, how do you get more time back in your day so that you can be more productive and effective and get more done? And so that's been resonated well. I think the questions, I talk a lot about, the wrong questions funders ask that lead them down the wrong path.
Yeah.
And also, there's a whole chapter 8, I think it is 12 questions I think all funders should be asking. And people really have resonated with that as well.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because those were the two that I would have put out. They're right in the middle of the book. I think the wrong questions is like the last of the delusions, and which questions to ask is sort of the first of the, how to address them. And I can just imagine you could pull those two out, and it applies in in every situation. And I think for people leading nonprofit agencies, delivery organizations, if you will, the three wrong questions is something that I found really powerful. So I want to get to that in just a moment, but I titled this session, what should nonprofit leaders do about a delusional philanthropist? And I just want to confirm, because I actually said the title before I'd read the book properly, so I'll admit that in full transparency. And had I had it's not that I've come up with another title, but I think the answer to that question is just move on. I mean, if you got a delusional philanthropist, it's like, well, this is probably not going to work in the short term. Move on. Find someone else, because you're not going to necessarily change them. However, so I'll ask you to confirm that in a second. It does seem, though, if you have a relationship with a philanthropist, that you could address some of those wrong questions. So that might be an entry point. If there's I think most people will be open to that, strangely. But anyway, is that if you that I was an ED or board chair and I said, I think this grant maker I'm working with is suffering from one or more of the delusions you identify, Kris, what should I do? What would be your advice?
Well, I would actually say don't necessarily move on at all, because I can make the argument that all funders suffer from delusional altruism in some form or fashion.
Okay.
Quite frankly, we all do. This is really not meant to be like a blame and shame type of book. It's really meant to help people see their own blind spots, essentially. And I think we all experience these, but I do think it's helpful for nonprofits to understand that they're happening and why they're happening. And so, like, for example, I talk about fear and how fear holds funders back. And that's one of the chapters in the Delusions. And I think fear is really the reason why so many funders have this kind of scarcity mindset. But, so to understand, like, one of the fears is fear of losing control. So often funders will, as they fear losing control, they're giving their money away, but there's a fear of loss of control. And so that's why I think they sort of create all these tight restrictions, excessive application questions, money for programs, but not for personnel, refusal of giving core general operating support, only doling out grants in 1-year increments and not issuing multi-year grants, all these things. And so, I know that frustrates a lot of nonprofit leaders, because, everybody wants general operating support and multi-year funding, right? Because that gives you some freedom, some breathing room, space to be able to act accordingly, seize opportunities, navigate around challenges,
Plan.
and not piecemeal all this funding together.
Plan.
Hire coach.
Yeah,
right.
Hire coaches. Yeah, that's right. But also, just plan, and have a sense of,
right. Right. And not be scrambling all the time. But to understand, if you understand that it might be a fear of losing control, then you can respond differently. I think one of the important things that both donors and nonprofits need to do is build trusting relationships with each other, and be in constant contact, especially during a crisis. I think many nonprofits, I'm sure you experienced this too, when COVID hit, there was a lot of fear about reaching out to donors. Should I fundraise during a pandemic, right? And so they held back. But if you have a trusting relationship with your funder and you understand them, then that helps ensure those relationships continue, and you can simply have a conversation to say, here's what we need, how can you help? But if you understand that your donor might be feeling fearful and lacking control, then you can use that relationship to explain to them what's happening, let them know how you are using the funding. If the more they trust you and know you, the less fear they're going to have that they're out of control when they're allocating their funding.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And fear shows up again and again, and as does the scarcity mindset. And it's interesting. I think sort of it's very commonplace to reference the scarcity mindset when we're talking about fundraising, and we're thinking of scarcity with regard to money, but it really extends to all our resources. You mentioned control, clearly scarcity mindset around time. and expertise. There's scarcity in everywhere, everywhere if you look at it, and people fearful of whether they have enough, whether they are enough, whether they're in enough control, and it can make things really difficult to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the scarcity mindset in philanthropy, I think it's first, it's a mindset, and it's really thinking about, this misguided belief that if you maintain a Spartan operation, somehow that equates to delivering more value into the community. But it really is a mindset, and it happens sort of setting aside money and grants just in the minds of funders. It's believing that you don't have enough money to make a difference. You recognize that the problem is serious and it requires a lot of resources to create truly lasting change. But instead of, embracing an abundance mindset of like, who could we partner with and how can we leverage more resources to really tackle this? You might think as a funder with a scarcity mindset, well, we just have this little bit of money. We only give away whatever, $1 million a year, not 20 million. So we're just going to kind of fund Band-Aid solutions to the problem because that's all we can do, right?
Yeah.
It's really a mindset. Nonprofits experience this mindset a lot when funders, refuse to allocate funding toward, the things that nonprofits are required, need to run well, like hiring top talent, investing in good financial management systems, fund development efforts, executive coaching and training, professional development, good board governance, all these things, strategic planning, evaluation, I could go on.
Yeah.
These things are really important for a nonprofit to build, to strengthen itself and to be the best that it can be, to have the greatest impact. But funders often don't recognize this. They have this myth around overhead is bad, and only 10% of the grant can be allocated to overhead, not recognizing what they're doing is really hamstringing the nonprofit. And if you're a funder and you want to have the greatest impact on whatever issue or cause you believe in, and there's a nonprofit that you are funding and you believe in, don't you want them to have top talent and the ability to evaluate themselves and a fabulous board and top-notch fund development apparatus? Of course you do. But you have to recognize that it requires funding as well.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
So one of the delusions I anticipated was something around that. Because I see a lot this question of impact and effectiveness, because I see a lot of foundations list as their impact the money they give out. So and I'm like, wait a minute, you're enabling someone else to do impact. I get that, fair enough. We don't have to sort of be too pedantic here, but then not following through on looking at what actually happened with their funding. And yet I know that they've required lots of data returns and so on and so forth. But without the overhead, I mean, what reassurance do foundations or family foundations or whatever have that the programs are actually working, that they're structured properly, that they're getting the right people in them and the right people through them and achieving the right outcomes if there's not the system to support that work? And I thought that would be one of the delusions, but not that I was disappointed it wasn't there. But that was sort of my premise coming in, is like, oh, this impact delusion. But you've said it just now in a slightly different way, and I think in a sense more profoundly that it's a sector-wide issue, that if you really care about the impact, why would you hamstring it or undermine it in that way?
Exactly. And, evaluation it's a big question and issue that funders grapple with, because they do want to know that the money is making a difference. But there's a couple challenges. One is, again, the scarcity mindset and an unwillingness to pay for the cost of evaluation. And you'll see this in, a donor that gives $5,000, a relatively small grant, and can't understand why there aren't, evaluative outcomes as a result. Right. Well, they're not paying for it. Right. The grant has to be appropriately sized compared to the evaluation. Right. So there's a lack of willingness to pay for it. And then I think another challenge is a lack of willingness to walk your talk. So it's very easy for a funder to look at a nonprofit and put expectations on them that they're not willing to put on themselves as well. And so I think one of the ways is you expect, nonprofits to have outcomes and demonstrate their impact, but you're actually not expecting yourself as a funder to do that, or you don't know how, or you don't want to invest in it. Another way it's playing out, I think a lot, is around racial equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, in the United States, at least, there has been for many years an increasing awareness of the importance of supporting diversity, inclusion, and equity. And especially in the past, year, understanding, systemic racism in this country and police brutality, and really a racial reckoning, and a much greater deepening of awareness of the role of philanthropy to address this. But still, it's very easy, and I hear this all the time, where a white funder will say, well, we need to make sure we're funding only organizations that, have diverse leadership, which is good. Like, it's good to think about the leadership of a nonprofit, and if you want to address issues in communities of color, making sure that the organization is led and staffed by people of color from those communities, right? That's important. But not even thinking, do we need to look at our own leadership? Are we diverse? Like, are we even talking about racism, our own racism? Are we even thinking about this learning? Are we trying to diversify our own board? So it's putting these expectations on the nonprofit that you're not putting on yourself. Another big one is around innovation. So I would imagine if you looked at the funding guidelines of every foundation in the United States, for sure, the word innovation would show up. We fund innovative leaders, innovative programs, innovative nonprofits.
Right.
But rarely do funders actually ever define what they mean by innovation. Nor does anyone ever talk about how do you build your innovation muscle? Like, how do you actually become more innovative? Like, there's practical things you can do. And rarely does the funder ever expect that, like, they're going to be the one that's innovative. It's like, we'll fund you. You better be innovative, nonprofit leader. But, we're just going to like hand out the money. And so I think that's a larger issue as well of, kind of this lack of walking your own talk in philanthropy, that I think is improving in many ways, but certainly needs to be tackled.
Yeah, that's great. I thought there were many anecdotes in your book that showed that. One of the ones that sort of made me laugh out loud was the foundation that wanted to go on some extended listening tour. And you're thinking, and I think your advice to them was, you're filled with you have all the information you need. You have a staff full of expertise. You've got all the data. You've been doing this for years. You can't possibly be that far away that you would need the time and the expense of a listening tour.
Yeah, this is a big one. Really, this is one of the questions that I suggest people ask themselves. And again, this applies to nonprofit leaders as well, is what do I already know? Because the tendency for all of us is when we're posed with a question, we assume we don't really know the answer and we must go research. We need to go on Google. We need to conduct a learning tour, conduct an environmental scan or a needs assessment or whatever it might be, right? Interview a bunch of people. And I'm not against data, and you might need to collect
or learning or learning best practices.
Like, that's all good, right?
Right.
Evidence-based practice, all for it. But I think everyone, funders, nonprofits, need to start first by saying, what do we already know? And literally, like with yourself or your team, your board, your staff, brainstorm, whatever it is. Because you know more than you know. You're smart, you've been doing this work. So a lot of this happens in strategic planning where, and it slows down strategic planning and decision making where, at the beginning of any kind of strategic plan, funders will say, well, we must and do all this data collection, right? And if it just started with what do we already know about our community, about the needs we're seeing, about changes, demographics, either, literally what's in their heads at that moment, or even just kind of taking a day to kind of look at existing data, evaluations, recent reports from nonprofits, and, spent 2 hours brainstorming and someone typed this all up, you'll have so much insight you'll capture so much learning of what you already know. And then you can figure out, okay, well, what we know all this, but what do we actually still not know? There's still going to be things you don't know. But then you can go after that smaller bit of information and insight from, fewer people, or go after that specific information. It'll take less time and it'll cost you less money to gather that information, either hiring someone to find it for you or your own staff time. And yeah, so that's a really important one. I think that's a huge, I talk about how important strategic planning is and strategy is for both, nonprofits and foundations, but it can take way too long. I think this pandemic has shown us the futility of spending a year to create a, 5-year strategic plan.
Yeah, that's right. How would you recommend that in that situation you described, which I think is would be really, really good approach for lots of people, but I can imagine someone saying that they yes, they know quite a lot, but they're also making a lot of assumptions. They have some both implicit and explicit biases that they want testing, and by going off and doing all this, this research, they're hearing from different voices, and they're not just recycling what they think they already know. So I suspect there's a relatively straightforward way to check for that, rather than abandon the idea of what you already know altogether.
Yeah, so I think, first ask, what do we already know? And then ask, what don't we know? Because as smart and brilliant as you are, there's things that you don't know for a variety of reasons. And then the next question to ask is, who else needs to be involved? And I think this is a really important one for a lot of reasons, but certainly in terms of thinking about engaging more diverse perspectives to inform, whatever it is you're trying to do. And especially, the diverse perspectives of the people you're trying to help. And so that could be the nonprofit leaders that you're funding, or it could also be community members or people who are directly impacted by whatever issue you're trying to support. And that's really important because, it is often the people who are most impacted by something that know the most about problem and solutions or potential solutions. And, chances are pretty high that, regardless of who you are as a person in your own life experience, there's still a lot you don't know. But I do really think that when you start with what you already know, it gives you, something to work from, as opposed to kind of feeling like, oh, it's just an open question, as if you know nothing, because you wouldn't have gotten to the place that you are if you knew nothing, really.
Right. Okay. So just coming full circle then, if you come across a delusional philanthropist, or when you do, or you start to sort of assess and recognize perhaps the delusions that your particular foundation is working through, is experiencing, the response is not move on quickly, but is still to engage. And I think one of the other frustrations that I think people feel on the ground is that there isn't necessarily a single face of say a foundation. There might be the foundation's leadership and the strategic plan, but a lot of nonprofits are really in touch with a single program officer or someone who's managing a particular fund. And that person, can't really resolve the delusions of the organization or whatever. Is quite limited in the response. How would you recommend a nonprofit leader, just again from almost as much a mindset perhaps as anything else, just approach that relationship in order to not get sort of too frustrated or feeling like it's not a good use of their time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple things. One is, you're hitting on a really important point, that there are multiple layers of leadership within, let's just say, a foundation. And, an important piece of that is the board. And the people that any nonprofit has the least access to, chances are, is the board.
Yeah.
And they're hard to find, right? Because even if they list their names on the website, they're not listing contact information. And so, that's a challenge because a lot of these policy decisions are made at the board level. So the whole notion, for just take an example of, whether or not to offer general operating support to nonprofits, could be a board decision. The willingness to provide multi-years of funding could be a board decision, for example. So there could be a lot of things that, you might have a program officer in a foundation who, absolutely wants to provide general operating support, but can't. And they're not in a position of power to make that change. Even maybe the executive director isn't able to make that change. So that's, just kind of a reality. I think it's an important reality to recognize.
Yeah.
Secondly, a mindset shift, and you referenced this earlier, is that the mindset shift is recognize that you're a peer to the funders, and recognize that they need you really to fulfill their mission. Because, a funder, whatever their mission is, let's say it's to, support arts and culture in their community, isn't the one providing arts education, isn't the one like leading the docent tour of the museum, right?
Yeah.
Or running the museum, right? They're the one funding it. And so as
so
the
you're
nonprofit.
Yeah, so sorry to cut. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but it's an important point here around shifting the power basically the power balance between you as an executive director, because you are the keys to the impact, and so really
Yes.
you need to work in more of a level partnership.
Mm-hmm. And even just to view yourself as a partner. Again, it's a mindset. Like, you might not say this directly to the funder, but if in your head you're questioning, do I call the donor or do I not call the donor? You know what I mean? Like those moments where you're like, I know I need to make these donor calls, but I'm holding back and I'm procrastinating, and maybe they're too busy, and you talk yourself into all this stuff. Well, it's the mindset shift of like, actually they need me. Like, I'd be doing them a disservice not to get in front of them and build a relationship or call them right now, because I'm helping them fulfill their mission. They're lucky to have me. You know what I mean? I mean, it really is a mindset, because it's true. They are meeting their missions through the nonprofits that they're supporting in large part. And that's important. And then also just recognizing that, just viewing yourself as that peer, I think is equally important, which is a hard thing to do because there's an obvious power dynamic. One of you is handing out money, one of you is asking for money. There's a power dynamic.
Well, there's also an application process. There's a formal process, even if it's simple and quick. On the one that there is, as you said, there's the physical task of completing that application, and that, as you said, that sort of feels very real, like cap in hand. But what you need to be, I guess, part of that mindset shift would be thinking of that as a bureaucratic technique on behalf of the funder to process the requests, and not really, not really a standoffish, you've got to jump through these hoops and these hurdles to even talk to me.
Yeah. And, that's a good way to think about it too. And just, just see yourself as a peer so that it is a conversation, it is a relationship. And then the third thing I'd suggest is try to build relationships across the organization. So not just with the one person you might be working with. If there's others in the organization, you could begin to build relationships with too, even if it's just, coffee or sending some information, or I don't know, asking questions on a webinar, whatever it is, because, people leave, there's turnover. And it's important that you're known not just with the one program officer, but also with the executive director and maybe a board member if you can. If there's opportunities to speak, sometimes, again, when we can all gather, boards want to hear from grantees directly, and people are invited to speak at board meetings. Any opportunity you have, I think, to get in front of the people in the foundation, in the corporate giving office, is very helpful, because, building that breadth of relationship is very helpful.
Yeah, and it reminds me of the sort of always good advice that the relationships don't start when the grant award comes in. It starts long before, and so therefore you need to have a strategy, because again, you only have so much time and effort to put towards this in your balance of priorities, that you can't just sort of play shotgun tag with donor search or grant station and just just sort of apply to everything willy-nilly. You've really got to be thoughtful about your approach, and try and humanize it with the relationships as much as possible.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned both strategy and priorities, because I really think this is one of the most important things that all of us need to be doing right now, which is to, if you don't have a clear strategy for the next 12 months, to create one. If you have one from last year, or God forbid, longer, it probably needs to be refreshed. And again, as I referenced earlier, this is not like a 1-year process where you have to gather all this data necessarily at all. I think strategy can be developed really quickly, as in like a day or a week.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think especially, you know, lately, the beginning of this decade has been particularly bizarre and turbulent, and the conditions are constantly changing. We keep having these crises one after the other, and it can feel impossible to plan ahead. But I really think it's important for all of us, for funders, for nonprofits, to create a plan that you can count on quickly, to begin using it for as long as that makes sense, and then to change it rapidly as conditions change, because conditions will change and continue to change. And I think, again, part of it is a mindset shift, to switch from this mindset of the future is uncertain and so you're paralyzed,
Right.
to really recognize that the future is always uncertain. Disruption is the status quo, and let the unknown future free you, because you can't possibly plan for every contingency. So don't try. Instead, recalibrate your timeline and figure out, again, asking those right questions. What are we trying to accomplish in the next 12 months? Where are we today? And then how do we best get from where we are today to where we want to be? What are the 3 or 4 most important priorities to focus on? What's that 20% of effort that's going to drive that 80% of result?
Mm-hmm.
And who's accountable for each of those priorities, and really get people moving on them, and assume that things are going to have to change along the way, and literally build in time in your calendar every month, every quarter, whatever makes sense, to check in on your progress, to say, well, what's working in implementing this new strategy? What's not working? What's changed in the world, in our organization, that might require us to stop doing something, or add something, or change something, so that you always have a living, breathing, sentient strategy that's your framework for guiding your decisions. And that also helps you as a nonprofit to figure out, well, you have clarity on your strategy. You can then articulate that and describe that to the funder, so they understand what you're trying to do and how they fit in. And then it can help you to identify the right funding partners to go after, and really even how to frame your whole message.
Yeah, that's a great sort of overview, I think, of what it boils down to, and I think is that the 3 to 5 year strategic planning cycle that I think people have sort of fallen into was really because 3 to 5 years seemed about the amount of clarity we had. You couldn't really see beyond that. And now sometimes, in certain situations, it's 3 to 5 months, or it's 10 to 12 months, or whatever it is. But you adjust. And what I loved about the asking the wrong questions, and your recommendation about the right order and the right way of framing them, I'd like you to sort of summarize that for us if you can. But to me, that was infinitely adjustable. That's what I love, is like, wow, you can use these everywhere. You can use this for the strategy for the day, the strategy for the week. You could, and it doesn't matter whether you're whether you're funding, or whether you're receiving money, or putting together your application and what you're going to do with it. Asking these questions in this order, and I don't mean the 12, I mean the 3, the way you said the wrong questions. Can you just walk through that really briefly? Because I just think it's magic.
Yeah. Well, the first wrong question to ask is how. And how do you do something? And of course, how is a perfectly fine question, but it's the order in which it's asked. And so I think what you need to do is ask first what, before asking how. And this is really about like clarifying your strategy before your tactics, because it's too easy for all of us to jump into tactics, like how are we going to do something? But you can't possibly know how to do something until you know what you're trying to do. And while that seems obvious, we don't actually act that way, right? Too often we kind of jump into the how we're going to accomplish something without clarity on what we're actually trying to do. And we do this.
Sorry, I was
Go
going to
ahead.
say what I thought was profound about that was that what we actually end up doing is working out um, what seems reasonable in terms of the how, and then saying, well, therefore, that's what we're going to do.
Yes,
In
yes,
so many meetings, so people say, well, how would you do that? And then you get bogged down, you get into the weeds, and they work out this how that, seems doable. They go, okay, so then that's what we're doing. It's like, yeah,
yes.
it's so frustrating.
Right, right. So it really limits your thinking. It limits your possibilities, right? If you think about, what are we trying to accomplish? And that could be big. And that could be like a big 10-year goal. But, what are we actually trying to accomplish in the next year? Because I think you're right. We can only plan out about a year max at this point. And then figure out how to do that. And another question to ask is, is really thinking about like, what are all the ways? Like the wrong question to ask is what's the best way to do this? So we figured out what we're trying to accomplish. And then your next question might be, what's the best way to do that? But I think that's a wrong question because you really need to figure out what are all the ways we can do this, right? So allow yourself the freedom to brainstorm every possible way you could accomplish something. Because when you start with what's the best way to do it, it can be very limiting. Like you imagine you're sitting around your, conference table or on Zoom and you're like, what's the best way to raise $1 million? And everyone's looking at you like deer in the headlights because no one knows
The
what the
single best way, like there's a right
best way. Or you might think, oh, I do know it, but I'm not going to say it. I'm afraid to say it. But allow people to really brainstorm all the possible ways because you might come up with something you didn't think of. And only then can you really figure out what's the best way to do it. And then again, I think, getting clarity on, your priorities and really getting people implementing them quickly. And then the last wrong question I share in the book is, let's get started right away. Or I guess it's not a question. How quickly can we start? Whatever the question is. And again, you might think that because my focus is on increasing speed, that would be a good question. But I do think it's worth, before you jump into action, to think about what are the risks and really assess what are the prudent, prudent risk. So is whatever you're trying to do, does it fit with your overarching strategy? What are the opportunities and challenges? What's it really going to take to implement this? What are the costs and benefits? You don't have to spend a lot of time figuring that out, but I do think it's worth taking a moment because not every interesting idea is worth pursuing and assessing risk. And that might simply be so that you can then mitigate it. You can say, yeah, this is risky, but it's a risk we're willing to take because the payoff could be really big. And here's the things we're going to put in place to try to mitigate that risk. So I think, those are really the three questions: asking how before what, asking what's the best way to do something before figuring out all the ways to do it, and asking how quickly can we get started before assessing risk, I think are the wrong questions that many funders ask.
Yeah, but I think again, it's applicable to just about any effort, any effort that you want to do, and so many times with nonprofits, or early stage nonprofits, founding nonprofits, fast growing nonprofits, where the programming is expanding, or like in times of crisis or extended lockdown, when you have to re-engineer what it is you're doing, you start with what is it we're trying to do, what are all the ways we could do it, and what are the risks involved, and how do we manage them? And those are like the classic questions, but you can wrong foot yourself by setting off with how and best, and and then pouring urgency all over everything, and assuming we're gonna do this overnight.
Absolutely. I mean, an easy way to think about this, I think, is around communications. So, you might think about how can we increase our, brand awareness or our communications, and you jump into the how. So you say, well, should we be on Twitter or Instagram, right? Both of those could be wrong, right? You don't even know because you have no plan of what you're trying to accomplish, right? And then you'll, figure out what's the best way to, what's the best way to get onto Twitter? What's the best way to promote ourselves on Twitter? And then you say, well, we need to hire I don't know, an outside social media consultant. And great, who knows somebody? I do. And then like off you go, on your Twitter campaign, which could be entirely irrelevant to whatever you're trying to do, because you have to first figure out what are we trying to accomplish with communications, and along with that, like, who's the audience and what are we trying to get them to do, and then figuring out like what are all the options for reaching that audience with these communications goals, and then picking the one that or few that are the best, and then figuring out, what are the risks, the costs, whatever associated with this. Is it worth taking some prudent risk in doing this? I think those are really important and applicable to anything.
Yeah, as are the 12 questions, I think. So I think, just again, I think they're very sensible things in terms of they're basically the implementation questions and very, very generalizable. I feel like we could speak all day on this. We're running out of time now. What's next for you, Kris?
Well, before I jump into that, what's next, I just want to share one resource that I think will be of interest to your listeners that I referenced. It's actually a free guide. It's called 8 Things Every Philanthropist Can Do to Change the World, Even When the World Keeps Changing. And you can download it if you just go to 8things.org. It's a free download. And again, not unlike the book, it's titled, as a guide for philanthropists, but it's entirely relevant for nonprofits as well. And it's really about what I talked about, how to kind of create that plan quickly. If it's your strategic plan or your fundraising plan, communications plan, you're planning a wedding, whatever it is, how do you create that plan quickly, begin implementing it right away for as long as it makes sense, and change quickly as conditions change around you. And it offers, again, 8 practical steps to do that.
Fantastic. So thank you for that. So that's it. That's at 8things.org.
Yes.
And is that 8 with the numeral 8?
It's actually either way. I bought both of the domains.
You bought both. Clever.
8, number 8, or 8, the spelling it out 8.
Okay. 8things.org. Okay. That's great.
So what's next? That's a great question. I continue, the work that I do is a lot of strategy development with, both nonprofits actually and foundation leaders, strategy implementation. I help a lot of my clients once they have their strategic plan, and then they're often kind of stuck, like, well, how do we start implementing this? Or why is nothing happening?
Yeah.
I help them really jumpstart the implementation of it. And then I do a lot of advising and coaching with philanthropy leaders. I have a program that's really taking off. It's called VIP Strategy and Coaching Day. And it's either a day together in person when that can happen. And of course, now it's virtual. But it's really a day dedicated, like, one-on-one to my clients to help them really like jumpstart their work or whatever they're grappling with.
Yeah.
Helping them, take their work to a next level, identify their goals, and together we come up with an action plan of what they can do differently over the course of, 2 to 3 Zoom sessions. So people like that a lot right now because it's virtual and it's quick. It can help really get someone the next steps that they need to create the change that they want to create.
That's excellent. And people can find out more about that on your website?
Yes.
Putnam Consulting. Right. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you. This has been Nonprofit Problem Solver, the podcast with Kris Putnam-Walkerly, and we've been discussing her book, Delusional Altruism. Strongly recommend you go and pick up a copy and join us next time. We're always here Wednesday at 11 Eastern. Thanks, everyone.